Hello, welcome back. Thank you for being here. Maria, I'm so excited to have a conversation with you. You and I have been on in a couple of trainings together. You helped me out and put together a YouTube video that talks about how not to be performative during Hispanic Heritage Month. We're going to talk about the term Latin, Latinx, etc. So that's why I hesitated and stuff. So I'm so fascinated by your background, and I really enjoy our conversations. And I know that you're going to bring a very unique angle to this conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion communications and inclusive language as it relates to policies. This is going to be a really interesting conversation. So please introduce yourself and we'll get into it.
Thanks. My name is Maria Gamboa. I'm a consultant, and my prior life was as an academic, trained as a historian. And so that's what I did. I studied the history of a lot of policies to understand them. And I think what I do too is help improve programs and understand the purpose of programs and how they're written and who they're actually for, and if they're achieving their goals. So now I do strategy consulting for nonprofits and foundations, and a lot in healthcare and education. But that's my day job, and so I'm always asking hard questions about programs, what their goal is, and also resistance to implementation, because that's one of the things, right? That it's one thing to write something down, it's another thing to implement it and enforce it and fund it. So those are some of the questions. How does it work in practice?
Well, you have your PhD, which is so impressive. And I would like to learn about what got you to do the topic that you did on your dissertation, and what were some of the key things that kind of were takeaways for you, that kind of surprised you within the work that you now do in your consulting?
Yeah. So my research was actually on the history of comprehensive immigration reform. So the 1986 act that many remember as an amnesty, but which actually started as an employer sanctions bill. So how did that happen? I study that, and I study how Latinos were being recognized as a domestic minority group that needed protection and resources at the same time that undocumented immigration was growing. And so the problems that created for these advocacy groups that were trying to increase protections for Latinos in education and employment and voting and housing, all the areas where it shows up. And people were testing the limits of that inclusion back then in the 60s and 70s especially, to see if it included immigrants. And sometimes people hadn't thought that it could include immigrants, or that immigrants would ever access rights and resources. And so once that started happening, they started to write exclusions to make sure that immigrants were not included. And so now we're in a moment where states are rewriting policies to be inclusionary or exclusionary. And that's important when we talk about inclusion, just because inclusion makes some people very uncomfortable because it requires a shift in mindset. And sometimes people have very definitions just of what it means. Some people think it means inclusion at the bottom and that people will be satisfied with that. And other people think it means inclusion at all levels, even at the top, even in leadership. So that's some of what I examined. And for example, just real quick, this is when they were debating if undocumented kids should have the right to go to public school. And when it went to the Supreme Court, the justices were asking, okay, what are the implications if undocumented kids are given the right to go to public school? Do they get to go to college too? What if they ever want to go to college? And the lawyers for the kids were saying, well, we're not talking about college. That's not included. We're only talking about K through 12. So even then, there are limits on how much inclusion we're talking about. And so that's always something to keep in mind.
You had mentioned inclusion can be uncomfortable. And, if we were just to look at that sentence, it seems like inclusion would be uncomfortable. Doesn't everyone want inclusion? However, the work that you do, in looking at programs and at policies specifically, because policies are where the institutionalization of racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., exists. But it's what we talk about here is language leads to behavior. So there is intentional language written into these policies, to your point, that is exclusionary. However, on the surface, we may not necessarily see it. We may not notice it. Are there some common phrases or some examples that you can share where you've come across language that actually seems like it's a good thing, a positive thing, but actually it's quite exclusionary in practice?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of examples from the present and the past. So sometimes it's the groups omitted. So sometimes when you have a policy, it'll say things like, and I'm thinking like the National Labor Relations Act, for example, that included new protections for workers, right? The fine print said this excluded farm workers and domestic workers, which were racialized categories. So sometimes the fine print's like this policy is for everyone except this group, which is a group that is not called, you're not saying Black and Latino, but you're saying by some other name. And so I'm just thinking, so many examples. Another example in history is just, are you able to enforce the thing? So things that sound good, but I had written down like the GI Bill, which had given people the opportunity to go to college and buy a home, but the reality was like segregated schools, segregated neighborhoods. And so how do you enforce it? But when you talk about language, I think there's some of the things are ignoring present inequities. So I could see policies where voting rights, for example, there's bills right now to say that we don't need protections anymore for voting, for voting because we've reached equality or parity. And so it means getting rid of kind of oversight to ensure that the process is being carried out in a way that people have access to voting. But if you think historically, right, in 1965, when the Voting Rights Act passed, there was, just because you were given something doesn't mean you can do it. So now I think there's bills to require ID or to make it harder to vote by mail. Even things like in reproductive health care, which we do a lot of work, sometimes the groups most affected by policies are not named, right? So with restrictions on abortion, for example, they don't say the groups most likely to be affected by it. But so what I'm saying is just that it's a lack of acknowledgement of present inequities that mean policies are going to impact certain groups more heavily, right? Or more negatively. Student loans, if you look at the data of like who takes out loans, who has the highest debt burden, oftentimes you'll see it's historically excluded groups that don't have the safety net and wealth to pay for their own education and things like that. So I'm thinking legislatively, but there's a lot of ways in which things are written in a way that seems neutral or just general, and that makes the argument is that it's the idea is that it won't impact groups differently, but I think the hidden subtext or context of like the history of this country is what would explain why it would have a disparate impact. And so part of the thing is then what's the impact versus intent? Just because you didn't mean for it to have an impact on certain groups, or you wrote it in a way that it's not calling that out, doesn't mean it won't. And I think that's part of the resistance against critical race theory, for people to know what actually happened and why policies reinforce inequities even if they're not naming groups by name.
I think it's a really important point, and how it's baked into policies and systems and infrastructure in such a way that it's creating barriers for certain demographics and communities. However, to your point around voter suppression, for example, it's intended to disenfranchise and control more of the Black community's vote. It is also harming people with disabilities and other white people, frankly, who have a harder time with transportation, for example. So it actually is still hurting dominant cultures, but they don't see it that way. And so the way the language is positioned and who it's coming from, to what audience, for what impact, it's actually, there's a self-sabotage that happens. It's like where Heather McGee talks about the draining of the pool, so, back in the day.
Everyone loses out. Yeah.
Yeah, everyone loses out. And I've seen more and more examples lately of, well, if this person wants to do this and we don't want this person to do this, so then we're going to make up a new rule. We're going to come up with a new policy, or we're going to amend a current one to mean that nobody can do this thing because this one person wants to do this and we don't want that person to do that. So we're just going to change the rules so nobody does it. So there's different versions of draining the pool that are alive and well today. So one of the things that I think people really don't really understand, like when I started a job and I'm reading the code of conduct, maybe in my first couple of days at the job, and then I never look at it again, the employee handbook or the code of conduct, et cetera. There's things in there and I don't even know anything about the company yet. I haven't started up, I'm just ramping, and there's all the pressure of, whatever, that whole time period when you're onboarding into a company. But one of the things that some of us, not all of us will do, but we'll sign the form to say that we read the employee handbook or the code of conduct, right? But if we did, we don't look at it again. We just kind of operationalize ourselves within the unwritten rules of the culture, the workplace culture. So, and then if we do something and somebody actually wants to create a situation to retaliate or punish or fire us or whatever it is, that's when the employee handbook comes back into motion and like, well, you signed the document. So language becomes a weapon in those scenarios. And it also is a way to control culture on a subjective basis. And there's things within our employee handbook and our code of conducts that I'm reminded of a work done, I don't know if you've read it, by the Stanford Innovation Review, where it's titled The Bias of Professionalism. And it talks about the policies and practices, the employee handbook, what this subjective term professionalism is and how it shows up. My point in bringing all this up is that when language is used as a weapon, basically referred to in a way that could be vague just enough to let a lot of people interpret it in different ways. So there's kind of a wild, wild west that, is at play here. And this is happening in Florida around the book bans and how DeSantis is defending, saying, I never said that, but it's written in such a vague way that one person can complain about a book or a documentary on Ruby Bridges and then it's pulled. So the ambiguity of language, but also utilizing the code of conduct or whatever in a way when you know that the employees aren't really looking at it, but then you can use it as a weapon. There's a real world and a real life impact to what is baked into these things. Can you speak to that a little bit or have some more examples?
Yeah. You mentioned the book ban. I'm just trying to think how else this shows up. I mean, part of it, to me, what it brings to mind is just that when things are vague like that, it would be helpful in the organizations that we work with if you actually have a shared meaning across the organization of what you're talking about. When you say professionalism, when you say equity, when you say inclusion, when you say, like, what does it look like? What does it feel like? What's an example? But I mean, just what it's bringing to mind too is that you do, when you join an organization, follow along with the behaviors that are modeled by the leaders, by the supervisors, by those in power. So depending on who those people are and their belief systems is can create exclusion for to those who think differently, who operate differently, who have a different background, who even have different opinions. So I'm just wondering if there's anything more specific you have in mind.
No, I think that's great. I mean, we're going to be talking to somebody in another episode talking about the impact of stereotypes from the media, for example, where we've had CEOs make comments of that there is no connection. This is just entertainment. These are just stories. There's no real world impact to these stories, that we tell, these fictional characters, and there's no bigger BS than that. So we'll talk a little bit more about how language and visuals have been actually used that has actually had real world impact as well. So many of the folks that are listening are professional communicators, and they are setting the tone and the personality of what the language is within the organizations from which we serve. So can you talk about some examples that you have found in the work of when you're looking for inequities and equities within the policies and any other kind of content that you review and you're looking for, that communicators can have an influence and start to have these conversations of being able to have a DEI lens on what they are putting out as communicators, but also what they're supporting when it comes to code of conduct or employee handbooks, policies, other practices, processes, et cetera. What does that DEI lens look like? What do we need to be looking out for within language?
I think it's a long process. So there's the education piece. I would list it as education, empathy, and humility, but you have to build that in, right? Not just write it down. So education, I'm thinking you have to be curious and open, learn and read. So we talked a little, I've come across this, right? The controversy on, we were talking about Latinx or pregnant person. It's kind of a privilege to not have to understand those terms or to just disagree with terms. And I think a good communicator is someone who's curious and open to learn and read something that might not affect them directly, but that affects people in general. And empathy is learning what's actually at stake, right? I think you were mentioning like how language has an impact on people's lives. With the term pregnant person or Latinx, right? Learning what's actually at stake. So even with pronouns, people have pushed back, or with the term Latinx, thinking it's vanity, or people are being, not getting what's the point. And it's much deeper, right? We're talking about safety. We're talking about inclusion and belonging, so people can focus on what they're there to do, so that they can work in peace, so that they feel safe to go to work, so that they feel safe to use your services. They feel welcome at your institution. And what's behind it is the danger and risk, just people's sense of safety, their ability to concentrate, the reality, right, that certain groups face violence, harassment, physical danger, but also mental, that all this contributes to like making it harder for them to just focus because they're feeling aggression. And so I just think a lot about education, right? Like there's experts on this stuff. We're not all experts, but we can tap into those resources. And then the empathy, thinking about what's more important, right? My convenience or your safety. Yeah.
Just pause right there. Say that again and break that down a little bit.
Yeah. I was saying it's a privilege to not know or care about things that don't affect you, right? Because you're not in danger. And if you don't have to learn the terms, or if you don't have to learn what it means or why it's important to use a term that includes people, that acknowledges the humanity of people who are excluded, right? What the importance, the power of that versus you're too lazy to get it right. Right. And I think part of that is that we're all imperfect. We all make mistakes. We all mess up. So a humility is involved too, right? That you're probably going to mess up, but your embarrassment can't be bigger, right? Than like so if you're so embarrassed, you can be like, oh, it never happened. I can keep messing up, because it's more embarrassing to admit when you mess up. For me, right? I feel nauseous when I let people down.
I
But
feel shame. Yeah, I experienced
yeah,
that.
but
Yeah.
imagine what the other person feels that felt harmed. That's even
Yeah.
worse.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's not their job to educate us. That's the problem, right? Because imagine like feeling harmed and then being like, actually,
Yeah.
this is why it matters. Like, that's horrible. So, it's kind of on us to, yeah, apologize, do better, learn, and change, right? And so it's okay to mess up, but don't let your ego like take over the impact, right? And so just a lot of advice, you know, for people with privilege to use their privilege as allies. So if someone says something that is exclusionary, discriminatory, don't wait for a person from that group to bring it up. Like, that's a lot of weight to carry. Step in.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I just have more examples. I think we were talking about our kids, and we're all imperfect. So I'll just say, like, I mess up a lot too. Communicators are people too, right? So don't expect perfection.
People first. Yeah, absolutely
Yeah.
right.
So it's kind of like you have to be open to continuous improvement and not take it personally if you get it wrong, but take responsibility to do better. And I think, I mean, I don't know if this fits, but don't just think about the money. Because I think some campaigns think about, oh, you're inclusive to reach more markets and blah, blah, blah. That may not be true for, you know, with this beer controversy, um, but just you know, it's more at stake. Back to the part about empathy, like, what's the significance, right? If you reproduce language that puts people at risk or questions people's humanity or excludes people, that's going to have an impact. And it doesn't, you know, even if you can improve and get it right, but if you choose not to get it right, that doesn't look so good for your company and the harm that you can be causing inadvertently.
And it's not up to the other person to get over it or take a joke. And we can do a whole episode on all of this.
Yeah,
I
that's
just
extra
really
work.
loved how you laid it down with that. Your inconvenience is not more important than my safety.
Yeah.
And I really love that point. And thank you for deconstructing it out and helping people hear that. Yeah, we were talking about our kids offline before we were recording, and how I won't tell your side of the story, but my side of the story is that I have a 12-year-old daughter who, although she is adopted, her birth family comes from Eastern Europe. She has white skin, brown hair, etc. And so we actually have conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, believe it or not. I mean,
Yeah.
I bought her, you know, the youth version of, you know, how to be a young anti-racist, for example. She loves learning about history and presidents. And so I utilize that to talk about colonization and the Holocaust and all kinds of things. So, because she's interested in it. And when I misgender or I assign a gender, like if we're driving and somebody cuts me off and I say, I can't believe he did that. You know, my default is he. When I can't identify a gender, I just go to he, right? And my wonderful kid will say, you don't know if it's a he, you know, like, you're right. You're absolutely right. And there's things that don't come to her attention. Like she'll talk about the word normal. And then, you know, I choose a time, but that's one of those flag words. I'm sure you have flag words that kind of make your ears perk a little bit. That and like, let's powwow, you know, those are kind of like, those are my kind of, kind of words, and I have many of them, but whenever I hear the word normal, and so I've had that conversation a couple of times with her, and if I say it, she will bring it to my attention. Like, so
Oh, wow.
she's getting that this word normal doesn't really exist, and it's existing to protect a certain structure, and it's not making room for people to be who they are. That there's some sort of standard that people are failing to meet if they are not normal, and what normal is, and we're all supposed to just understand what that definition of normal is. So it's been an interesting conversation. What about you?
Oh my God, I love this because, first of all, kids hear everything you say.
Yeah.
My kid is 3, okay? There's things I forgot we said that she reminded us of when she was younger than that. So I think for me what happened is she has not internalized stereotypes, but she's getting there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a long story, but basically we were in Mexico, and my mom lives in Mexico, and she doesn't have screens on her windows. And so the mosquitoes, when we stayed with her, we got bit by mosquitoes. And then from there, it got summarized into there's mosquitoes in Mexico, right? And Mexico's weird because they have mosquitoes, right? And so she was telling me the other day that at school, because she knows she's Mexican, but she's not sure how much or what it
that
means.
means, yeah.
Or where Mexico is, so I had to buy her a globe. But she made the point, like, what'd she say? I'm Mexican, I'm normal, and I'm Mexican, or something like that. Sometimes I'm normal, sometimes I'm Mexican. That's like, actually, Mexican is normal. Everything's normal, right? White, brown, black, Asian, Mexican is normal. And she said, yeah, I love Mexico. Grandma lives there, but they're mosquitoes. It's weird, right? It's a little weird. It's like, no, there's mosquitoes here too. We just have screens,
Florida.
Yeah. And then I told her I'm Mexican. So it's kind of like not nice to say that anyone's weird, right? But that was a lot for her to handle. She started crying because she thought she had offended me. You know what I mean? So it's like deep. This is deep stuff. And I told her, you didn't know. You're just trying to figure out how this all works, where these places even are. So, I mean, the lesson there is just like be gentle, but kids are curious, and so we need to educate ourselves to be able to translate to them like what that means. But I do think it's good to talk about race in an informed way. And there's a book I read before I had kids called Nurture Shock. I think that's what it's called. That talks about, you talk to kids about everything, right? Disability, everything, right? So that everything's normal, actually.
Yes.
And they don't embarrass you in public one day saying, look, they're so, like asking you. And if they do ask you, you respond naturally. You don't tell them, don't say that. So I'm still learning. I'm just saying, because sometimes I know how to respond to adults, but not children. I mean, what do you do when a kid is racist and their parent's not there? I'm still learning how to figure that out. Because my initial reaction is like, get my kid away from that kid, right? Like, you don't need to be around this, but she'll be around it a lot actually on her own. So I'm not there yet. But yeah, I mean, part of it is normalizing everything and then being age appropriate, right? And that they don't mean harm. They're curious. But if you say stuff that's problematic, they're going to repeat it. So
now we've heard more often, especially since the summer of 2020, about the Black and African American community having the talk, the race conversation. I was raised in a very white household, even though I have Native American heritage. That wasn't brought into the conversation. It was just kind of, we didn't really talk about race and ethnicity, right? Because we're normal, like we were just talking about, right? So we never had those conversations. So I didn't grow up with the skills to name myself, identify myself, see my place in the world. That's part of the mentality of the obliviousness. That's part of why it works, etc. In the community from which you were raised, are those kinds of conversations while you're a kid?
I think that it's different, just on 2 dimensions. So what I hear about the talk is about safety, right? What do you do when you encounter a police officer to stay alive, right? Because it might go wrong. And so I can see that happening if you're an immigrant, right? How to navigate encounters with immigration. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is unspoken. You just know, don't mess up or don't call attention to yourself or don't, I was lucky enough to have legal status, but even you, you're very deferential, to immigration.
Mm-hmm.
Stuff like that, or to services that can report you to immigration and like jeopardize your family. I mean, I think it just shows up differently if there's an acknowledgement of discrimination or one's place on the economic ladder that you don't talk back, or speak up. So it just shows up in other ways, I think, like in the workforce. And especially I see that as a problem for first generation professionals who don't know how to advocate for themselves, manage up, or disagree. That's how
Mm-hmm.
it shows up for me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll just say the problem is that within the Latino community, there's a lot of racism towards Blacks and towards Indigenous people. So I can't guarantee that I'll just say there's that third element, and classism, right? Where in
Mm-hmm.
Mexico, I'll tell you, the police is not held in high regard, even the military, because it's seen like a working class occupation. And so I don't want to say that it's whiteness, but it's that if you have enough money, you can do whatever you want. And so there's not this fear of you're going to lose your life, just because there's so much privilege, among middle class Latinos. And then there's just a lot of racism towards, to distinguish themselves from people who are seen to have a worse
Mm-hmm.
situation. So it just shows up like in a lot of different ways.
And I can attest that when I came out, then the conversations with my parents was about safety. And my mom even asked me, like, okay, can you tell nobody? Because I'm really worried about your safety. Like, so she wanted to take advantage of my ability to pass, if you will.
Yeah.
That was really, really interesting. And I saw the love that she was trying to share with me on that. And unlike my color of my skin, that is seen however the world sees it, and it's not my choice, it's out of my hands, as if I were, I had more melanin in my skin than I do. I had a choice around being out, if you will. And there are certain situations where I do use that privilege, but in most situations, I do not. I don't take advantage of that privilege. But however, I also have height privilege. I have deep voice privilege.
Yeah.
I have athletic shape privilege, so I take advantage of that. It's like, it's not smart to try to do anything to me, right? Or say anything to me. But I also, that's also white woman privilege that I am leveraging as well. So if I was a transgender person of color who was shorter, for example, or different body shape, et cetera, I would not have these kinds of privileges, and it would be it would be more out of my hands. But I did have that safety conversation with my parents when it came to my sexual orientation. So I appreciate you bringing up that point. And because there's certain work environments or client environments where I still, to this point, at this age, I still don't come out everywhere I go because of safety. I will be traveling to Florida soon. Equality Florida has issued a travel advisory for the entire state of Florida for anyone who is LGBTQ+. It's not safe to travel here, certainly in certain pockets of Florida. A travel advisory has been issued. And I'm going to Florida, and I will be, I have the option, to be out or not, or wear the t-shirts that I have or not with the pride flag. And it's a safety situation, but there's also a sense of pride and solidarity and allyship and
Right.
wanting people to know that I am here and I see them. But there are people that don't have the choices and the privilege and the options like I do. And I recognize that, which motivates me more to be out to help with the stereotypes that can be more disproportionately harmful to people who can't necessarily hide as well as I can. So just in our last couple of minutes here, Maria, what does, tying everything that we talked about, the interpersonal, the intrapersonal communication, as well as the reviewing of our language that builds the nuts and bolts and functions and the infrastructures of our businesses, in our policies, our practices, our processes, et cetera. What does it look like, in your opinion, to communicate like we give a damn?
Part of me wants to say you can't have assumptions about what's normal, right? And which itself requires a growth mindset, right? Because how do you get it right? You won't get it right the first time. So I think partly is being open to continuous improvement, being open to feedback, and telling people what you're doing with that feedback. I don't know, paying people, if you do focus groups, or if people have a role in making your materials more inclusive, paying for that knowledge, right? But also building a capacity. So not relying on certain groups to point out the flaws, and recognizing the power dynamics inherent in that. If you're asking someone for feedback where you have more power and they don't feel comfortable actually telling you what they think to improve the language. So, and I think when I say normative, don't assume anything is normative. I mean, even the one thing I left out of the question you asked me about the talk, I mean, if you just look at the data, right, acknowledging reality is acknowledging the reality of inequities. And so that's why certain language is not going to land for some people. Something we didn't talk about is exclusion of people who are formerly incarcerated, right? I see a lot of advances in programs to address that discrimination, but in popular culture, there's still jokes, right, about what it is to be a prisoner. Even my 3-year-old, right? It's like, oh, a bandit has stripes. So very young, at 2 years old, people are learning like and kids try to like simplify good, bad. Is that good or a bad person? And that's not how it is. Some people are denied opportunities, right? And just about the talk, like Latino men, right, face enormous scrutiny, and they have to control their emotions. And so, like the point about privilege that you were speaking, being able to to make a scene, to advocate for yourself, to defend yourself, requires privilege that you won't face retribution for that, right? So anyway, just in terms of what's normative, expanding what we think is normative and trying to go back to things that are stereotypes. When you think about Disney movies that now have the disclaimer, this was offensive then, it's offensive now. Okay, like relook at things that for a long time have seemed okay, because things change. And just in terms of history, hard-won rights can be lost, right? And so look at the ways in which people are trying to create new exclusion, really, how do you say, very creatively, so that you can't tell, right? So, and there's a book by Ian Haney Lopez called Dog Whistle Politics. I don't have the whole title, but things like Make America Great Again, what does that mean? Right? You don't say anything, but you say a lot. You're saying go back to a time when people didn't have rights, when people couldn't vote, couldn't go to school, So just sometimes when we use language that seems just general, the people enforcing it show you who's included in that normal, right?
I used to teach in person. I still teach online at San Jose State University in California. And one of the classes I used to teach is media theory and research. One of the things that we would do as a class is that we would watch news stories, for example, and there's a lot to it. I'm only going to mention one slice of what we would pay attention to deconstruct it. But one of the things I would point the students' attention to, and it's something I test myself, in my own media criticism, critical thinking of media, etc., is to look at, okay, and I've made my own documentaries, so I know the conventions. This is what one does as a director, as a writer. You're telling the audience where to look, what you want emphasized, right? Everything in the frame is a character to support the story that has a certain theme to it, sometimes
right.
life lessons, etc., mirroring life, and sometimes not, etc. But it's very intentional to draw the eye and lead the audience in a certain direction. We are showing you what we want you to see. So there's elements that are emphasized, but there's also elements that are de-emphasized. What is being left out? Who is being left out? Why? Which, circling back to what you said at the beginning, as far as the programs that you evaluate, like, why are we doing this program? And what is the effect of it? They may have an intention, but it may have a different impact. So this idea of looking at our language and seeing what we are emphasizing, who we are emphasizing, and then whether it's intentional or not, what are we de-emphasizing? Who are we silencing? Who are we leaving out?
Right.
And that's part of having that DEI lens on our work on a regular basis. Maria, thank you so much for bringing your expertise, your research and dissertation work, and your personal life, and talking about your kid. I just love the range of the conversation that we just had. How can people stay in touch with you?
I have a blog, mariagamboa.com, and I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram. So yeah, add me. Feel free to read what I write. It's a bunch of random stuff, but all with this lens. Because I deconstruct PBS shows. I deconstruct, higher ed programs. So it's just whatever I see with that lens.
Excellent. So people can learn and kind of learn off of your example of what you're seeing that's emphasized and what's being left out and de-emphasized. That's awesome. Thank you. I look forward to subscribing myself. All right. Thank you for being here, Maria. It was so great to have you here. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.
So what popped out to you from the conversation? The more conscious communicators in the world, the better the world. So go to communicatelikeyougiveadamnpodcast.com and set up a one-on-one strategy session. And until next time, let's keep taking care of each other.